If you were to stop this video right now and just Google the name Hannah Up, who is the focus of today's story, it would bring up a list of articles about her very strange disappearance. And all of them would start with the partial explanation for what caused all of this craziness to happen. But what I'm gonna do is basically the opposite. I'm gonna tell you the craziness of what occurred from 2008 all the way up until today, 2020. And then I'm going to reveal the partial explanation that many people believe is behind the disappearance. Not only does that make for a more compelling story, just purely from an entertainment perspective, but it also allows you, the viewer, to have an unbiased view of the events that happen, so that when I do make this reveal, you can be the judge if that is sufficient to explain away what ultimately happened to Hannah Up. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's something you'd be interested in, I would encourage you to steal the like button's favorite bar of soap, cover it in clear nail varnish, and then put it back and laugh at the like button when their soap doesn't lather. Also, subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Around midday on September 16th, 2008, the captain of the Staten Island ferry in New York City was looking out at the water just south of Manhattan, and he noticed something bobbing in the water. And he said that it just didn't look right. He was drawn to it. It was pretty far away, but he knew that there was just something off about it. Couldn't tell if it was a person or debris, but either way, he sent 2 of his deckhands over to have a look. So they hopped in a skiff, they drove over, and very quickly they saw that it was actually a woman, and her face was in the water. So as soon as they pulled up alongside her, the first thing they did is grabbed her head and kind of pulled it out of the water, and to their surprise, she gasped for air. They pulled her up into the skiff. She had on just running shorts and a sports bra. She had a very bad sunburn on one side of her body. She was hypothermic, she was dehydrated, and she looked like she had been in the water for a very long time. They bring her back to the ferry, they wrap her up in a blanket, and they call 911, and an ambulance is immediately sent out to go get her. As they're waiting for the ambulance, she starts to speak. "I was just out for a run. I went running just a couple hours ago. Why am I here?" They chalked it up to her being in shock, and based on her attire, she had running shorts and a sports bra on, they're thinking, okay, I don't know how she wound up in the water, but it seems like she went running, fell in the water somehow, and thank goodness we found her. She gets in the ambulance, they bring her to the hospital, and after the initial treatment is done and she's stable and laying in bed and being treated for hypothermia and for this bad sunburn, she starts saying to nurses and doctors she had just gone running like a couple hours ago. How did I get here? Why was I in the water? And they didn't know either. Finally, when she was able to confirm that she was in fact Hannah Up, and they got in touch with her family, who also confirmed that this girl sitting in the hospital bed is in fact Hannah Up, investigators were baffled because Hannah Up had been missing for 3 weeks, not 1 day. When they said this to Hannah, she couldn't believe it. At first, everyone was okay with Hannah not being able to remember because she just went through something traumatic. We'll give her a couple of days and then we'll reapproach the subject. But as time went on, it became clear that Hannah had absolutely no clue what happened over a 3-week period that she had been missing. 3 weeks before she was found, she had left her apartment in New York City to go for a run. This was the day before she was set to start a new school year at her school in Harlem. When Hannah did not return to her apartment that night, her roommates actually didn't think much of it. From what I can tell, the roommates were not particularly close, and it wasn't unusual for them to kind of have limited interaction. 4 days would go by before Hannah's roommates would notice that she still hasn't come back. So the first thing they did is they went into her bedroom inside of the apartment, and they quickly were able to find that her passport was in there, her wallet with her cash, bank cards, her ID. Basically, all of the most important items that you would carry with you anywhere you went were sitting in her room. At this point, they called the police, and a massive, massive search is ignited for this woman. Hannah was beloved, not only by her family, but everywhere she went, her students loved her. All of her friends would say that Hannah was their best friend. Everybody she was around loved her. She was the center of attention, life of the party. And so when she became a missing person, people came out of the woodwork to go look for this woman. They looked everywhere, and after a week, The family and friends were starting to lose hope, and the police would admit that at that point, they were just looking for a body. They assumed that she had been the victim of some horrible crime. Her case, her missing person case, had made national headlines because it didn't really make any sense. There was absolutely no trace of her. She'd just gone running and then vanished. And despite living in New York City, where there's cameras everywhere and witnesses everywhere, they couldn't find any footage of her. They had no leads. No one came forward. The New York Times would say it was as if the city had opened wide and swallowed her whole. Then there was this huge break in the case because there was an Apple store in Midtown Manhattan that spotted her clearly entering their store and logging into one of their computers. They saw that she logged in with her email address, but on that computer there was no record of her sending or receiving any messages. But she did successfully log in. And oddly enough, one of the people that went to school with her approached her and was like, Hannah? Hannah, is that you? You know, there's a huge search for you. Is this really you? Hannah, on camera, looks at him and says, no, I'm not Hannah. And she ups and walks away. Police show up. There's no sign of Hannah. She's gone. Police took the footage and showed it to Hannah's mother, and she recognized her 100%. That is Hannah. But no one could understand, why would she deny being Hannah? Is she being held hostage? A day later, she popped up on the security camera at a Starbucks in Manhattan. But just like the Apple store, by the time the report got to the police and they went to the Starbucks, she was gone. Same thing happened at a number of Manhattan gyms where she was apparently going and using their shower and then leaving. And she somehow was able to get inside the gym, but she didn't have her gym pass. So they don't know how she got in. And again, every time police showed up, she'd be gone. And there's lots of other unanswered questions. How are you able to do anything? You don't have your license, you don't have your wallet, you don't have bank cards, you don't have a passport, we don't know where you're sleeping, where you're staying. How are you eating? What are you doing? Where are you coming from? What's wrong? While police were never able to determine where she had been sleeping at night in those first couple of weeks, they did determine that at some point towards the end of this 3-week period, she decided to leave Manhattan. And so she jumped into a kayak off of Chelsea Pier and began paddling south. At some point, we don't know when, she jumped out of the kayak and began swimming south. And after several hours of swimming, she wound up at Robin's Reef, which is this incredibly isolated lighthouse that sits on this tiny little rocky island. She managed to pull herself up onto the island and then sat there on these rocks for almost 24 hours. This is where police believe she got the really bad sunburn. Then some event led to her getting back in the water and kind of bobbing and drifting her way all the way back over to the south side of Manhattan, where she was ultimately spotted and then rescued by the ferry captain. It took police and investigators quite a bit of time to put together this storyline of what happened to Hannah over those 3 weeks. And when they brought it to her and her family and said, this is what we think happened to you, she still had no idea how any of this had happened. She thought she'd gone running, and then the same day she wound up in the water and was being rescued. While she was at the hospital, she had undergone a series of brain imaging tests to try to see what they could find, if there was some underlying neurological condition that might have caused her to forget this huge chunk of time. But the tests revealed no neurological issues. They concluded that the episode was psychological in nature. Because her case had made national headlines just when she had gone missing in the first place, and then had been found under such baffling conditions, not only physically where she was located, but her inability to remember any of it, it created even more buzz around the whole story. And so people began to think she was lying or that she had staged the whole thing, but she hadn't. She just didn't understand why it had happened. But as time went on, people forgot about it, people moved on, and she was able to more or less go back to a normal life, even though she herself was very unsettled at the idea that she had 20 days that she has no memory of. Fast forward almost exactly 5 years to September of 2013, and now Hannah is living in Maryland. She is an assistant teacher at a Montessori school, and Hannah goes missing again. On the day she went missing, co-workers claimed to have seen her just a couple miles away from the school, and they assumed that she was walking to work. But she didn't show up for work that day, and when they tried calling her, she didn't pick up. They went to her apartment, she wasn't there, and so just like 5 years earlier, they called the police and they launched a search for Hannah up. Early on in the search, police located Hannah's phone and wallet sitting on a walking path relatively close to where she worked. But they started searching the area and they could not find her. 2 days after the search started, Hannah's mother received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. When she picked it up, it was her daughter. And she said, "I don't know where I am, I don't know what's going on, but I'm okay." Hannah had regained her memory while laying in a creek bed next to a turned over shopping cart in some random park in Maryland, not the one where her phone and wallet were found. She had stood up, had no idea how she got there, and she flagged down a stranger and asked to use their phone and was able to call her mother. Her family, her friends, the police were all so relieved that she was found and unharmed that, much like the last one, she ultimately was released from the hospital because she wasn't hurt and was able to more or less move back into a normal life. Except Hannah at this point felt really guilty. She didn't understand why this was happening, but she felt really bad about it. And it was clear to her family and friends that she really wished she could somehow have a do-over. Just start fresh and start a new life where no one knew her as this person who keeps disappearing. A year after the Maryland incident, Hannah would move to the US Virgin Islands, a popular location for Americans that want to start again or go off the grid. She was able to land a job teaching at a Montessori school teaching 3 to 6-year-old children, and the director of the program would say that whenever they brought a family on a tour of the different classrooms, Hannah's classroom was always the first one they went to because she was such a great example of what children would expect if they came to this Montessori school. Because Hannah was not just a great teacher, she was a passionate teacher. She loved teaching, she loved her students, and she loved her new life in the Virgin Islands. But in September 2017, 9 years after her disappearance in New York and 4 years after her disappearance in Maryland, Hannah would go missing for a third time. Now, the lead up to this disappearance is a little bit unique relative to the other two. Right before she disappeared, there was a Category 5 hurricane barreling down on the Virgin Islands. And all of Hannah's friends, colleagues, everyone she knew was scrambling to leave the islands before it hit. But Hannah was not prepared to abandon the island and abandon her house and her school. And so she decides to stay behind. In the final few days before all of her friends and colleagues left the island, they described Hannah as being in some sort of a trance. She was hard to get through to, hard to speak to, but she seemed rather sing-songy, like she was in a really good mood, but very difficult to communicate with. On September 15th, just a few days before the hurricane would actually make landfall, the few staff members at the Montessori school who had stayed behind on the island to weather the storm called a meeting, and Hannah was not present. She was last seen preparing her Montessori classroom for the imminent impact of the hurricane. When they went to her apartment, she wasn't there, and so they went out looking for her. One of her friends knew that a favorite location of Hannah's was Sapphire Beach, and when she got there, sure enough, there was Hannah's car parked in the parking lot with her purse, passport, and hundreds of dollars inside of her car. Hannah's clothes were found down on the beach on a chair, neatly folded, but there was no sign of Hannah anywhere. A desperate search for Hannah was launched, led by the Coast Guard, but it had to be abandoned after only a couple of days because the hurricane was barreling down on them. And to this day, she has never been seen or heard from again. There's a huge part of this story that I've intentionally left out until right now. After Hannah was scooped up by the ferry captain and brought to the hospital after that first disappearance in 2008, they ran all those brain tests and they discovered that there was nothing wrong with her from a neurological standpoint. However, they did run a series of psychological tests and they discovered that she had an extremely rare form of amnesia called dissociative fugue. For those that suffer it, there are no symptoms leading up to it, and then all of a sudden, you forget all of your autobiographical information, but you don't forget how to live. Someone in a fugue state could very easily leave their apartment, go to a store, interact with other people. They just don't understand who they are. They don't know their name, they don't know their history, they don't know why they are located where they are. This can last for a couple of hours, all the way to years. The most famous example of dissociative fugue is Jason Bourne from the big blockbuster movies about the CIA operative who wakes up and has no idea who he is or why he is where he is. He doesn't know the people around him, but he recalls all of his training and is able to be this like ninja who can fight off bad guys left and right but doesn't know who he is. Now, when Hannah disappeared in 2008, almost certainly she was in a fugue state and then was located again, and thankfully she was alive. 5 years later, Same thing happens in Maryland. She goes into a fugue state, and then 2 days later she's found again, has no idea how she got where she got, but there she was. Now the tricky part is, in 2017 when she went missing, it would be very easy to say that she was in a fugue state because it had already happened 2 times before. However, other people believe that she just wanted to start her life over again. She hated being known only for her 2 disappearances. She wanted to be known as a happy, loving person, a great teacher, a great friend. And none of that was possible with her history. And so some say that she staged the last disappearance because she knew with the hurricane coming in that she would be able to kind of disappear without a trace, and people would assume that she was probably dead. So I'd love to get your take on what happened to Hannah Upp, specifically what happened the 3rd time she disappeared. Was this just another example of her being in a fugue state and disappearing? And will we hear from her again? Or did she stage all of this to run away from Hannah Upp and start all over again with a brand new identity, not tethered to the history that she really would like to forget? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll do my best to get back to as many of you as I possibly can. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, then I would encourage you to steal the like button's favorite bar of soap, cover it in clear nail varnish, and then replace it, and laugh at the like button when their soap doesn't lather. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads that sound an awful lot like what you just listened to today. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I also post quite a bit over on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen. So whether I see you on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, or some combination, I'm just very thankful for your support. And until next time, see you guys. No matter whether you believe this tragedy is the result of something paranormal or something normal and rational and explainable, no matter which way you feel, or maybe somewhere in the middle, the details of the story itself, the actual facts of the story, are horrifying. What actually happened to this poor family in the 1920s it's just one of the more terrifying ordeals that I've ever come across, and it's crazy to me that it's a true story. Without giving too much away, someone or something shows up on this farm and it doesn't leave. One of the maids starts hearing strange sounds. They start looking for this person or this thing. They start seeing things moving around in their house, and there's every indication that someone is in the farm. Someone has snuck into the farm and is terrorizing us. And then on March 31st, 1922, whatever it was, finally attacks. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the dark, strange, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then my channel is the one for you. That is literally all I do on this channel, and I upload 3 to 4 times every week. So if that is of interest to you, I would ask you to gently 360 no-scope the like button, subscribe, and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Back in the 1920s, there was a farmstead called Hinterkaifeck Farm that was located in southern Germany in a very rural, isolated, heavily forested area. So the occupants of the farm were the live-in maid and the Gruber family. The Gruber family was Andreas, his wife Azelia, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, Joseph and Azelia as well. And everything was going fine for the Gruber family and for their farm until the winter of 1921. When some very strange things started happening on their property. The first one to notice strange things happening around their property was their live-in maid. She spent the majority of her time in the main house, and she was alone a lot of the time. And she started to notice when she was alone that she would hear tapping, what sounded like in the walls. Not someone in another room tapping, but literally something in the walls. And she would go up and she would listen, and it would still be tapping, but she couldn't make sense of it. And then she started hearing a combination of disembodied voices and footsteps in the attic. And when she started hearing those footsteps and voices coming from the attic, she ran and told Andreas to say, hey, someone's in your attic. Andreas would go up. Even though he was skeptical, he'd go up to the attic and he would look, and not only is no one there, but it was this totally open space up there. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. There was no one up there, and there was no sign of anybody having been up there. There was no food, there was nothing. And so over the course of several weeks, the live-in maid kept saying that at night she'd be laying in bed and she would hear footsteps and voices from the attic. She'd hear tapping in the walls. She would tell Andreas, and then Andreas would be frustrated with her because he didn't really believe her, and he'd go charging up into the attic, and nothing would be there. And so she was just not having it. She'd been working with this family for a long time. She did not feel convinced that no one was there. She really thought this place was haunted. And so she ultimately tells the Gruber family, like, I'm sorry, but I can't stay here another night. Whenever I'm here, I feel like I'm being watched. And at night, I can't sleep because of the footsteps in the attic and these voices. I know you've checked, but I can't be here anymore. And so she quits. And it really catches the Gruber family by surprise because they rely on her help. And so they're kind of thrown for a loop because they have to replace her. And so she leaves, and now they need to go find a replacement. Over the following 6 months, they would not find a replacement, and it would create an increased workload for basically everybody on the farm, which led to a higher stress level. Everybody's kind of on edge. You know, the departure of the live-in maid was a really big deal. And so you got to put that in perspective as you hear what happens over the next 6 months. At first, after the live-in maid had left, no one reported hearing any strange sounds around the house. You know, they were so busy that they didn't even have time to consider if there was any sounds in the house that they didn't recognize. But eventually, Andreas would later admit that he started hearing the tapping sounds and the footsteps in the attic and the disembodied voices, and no one's there. And so now he's becoming paranoid, and he shared his paranoia with the rest of the family, who's now also hearing these sounds and these disembodied voices and the footsteps, and despite checking and now searching the whole property. Like, they've begun to actually do a full-blown investigation. Everyone's just stressed. They don't know what it's coming from. They're mad at each other for becoming paranoid. And so they just continue on with work and try to put it out of their mind that they're hearing these strange sounds. But the activity in the house would only intensify. What was initially just strange tapping sounds and what they thought were disembodied voices turned into things going missing around the house. Most notably, a set of their house keys went missing. And there's only so many people there. There's really not a good answer as to why they might go missing, and they only have a couple sets. It's a big deal to lose a set of keys, and they went missing and they couldn't find them. Once the keys went missing, the family couldn't stop thinking about the strange sounds in their house and wondering if there really was someone hiding in their house. It was terrifying. And then when young Azalea, one of the grandchildren, suddenly went missing one night, the whole family is in full panic. They go out looking everywhere for her. They're yelling in the forest. They can't find her. And then finally they find her, and she has no idea how she got out, where she went, and what even happened. She just was like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know how I got out. She was exhausted. She was confused. They brought her back to the house, and they're trying to get her to explain why you were doing that. She can't. They go back inside, and sitting on the table is a newspaper that Andreas didn't subscribe to. No one in the family had brought. No one even in the area, it would turn out, subscribed to this particular kind of obscure newspaper. And it's just sitting in their house. A couple days after that, they noticed that someone had clearly tried to break into their tool shed, which had loads of tools in there, very expensive. There was a lock on the outside, and there was very deep gashes into the metal. It looked like someone had been, hacking away at the lock to try to break it open. But, they're living in a very isolated part of Germany where there isn't much ambient sound. And so it was strange to them that someone had been so violent with this lock, hacking at this metal lock, presumably with something metal, and no one had heard it or reacted to it. None of the dogs had heard it, nothing. So just very confusing stuff is starting to happen around the property. But it would be what Andreas sees in the spring of 1922 that pushes he and his family over the edge from general paranoia to outright panic. So Andreas wakes up in early March of 1922. There was this huge snowstorm the night before. He gets up early and he goes to the back door of his house and he opens it up, and he can clearly see that there are footprints that have walked from the forest, which is pretty far away from his property. They have quite a bit of acreage. There's footsteps that are clearly coming out of the forest all the way up to the door that he has now just opened. And he's looking down at these footprints, and there's no return set of tracks. And so he's thinking to himself, well, whoever walked up to my house came into the house. So he shuts the door and locks it, and immediately goes and wakes up his family and says, hey, why are there footprints leading up to the back door? Because there's no footprints going away. Someone came to the back door and apparently came inside. his wife, his daughter, the grandkids, no one has a clue. The maid, nobody knows. They said, hey, we've been asleep, we have no idea. So now Andreas, I mean, he's obviously thinking about the strangeness that's happened in this house over the past couple of months, and so he's worried. So he opens the door back up and he looks and he's studying these footprints and he's like, I just don't get it. You have to turn around and walk back, otherwise you're here, you're at the house. He shuts the door and he walks around his house. He looks at all of the different exits to his house. So he looks to see if there's exiting footprints, which is scaring him thinking about it, which means someone would have come into the house and jumped out a window or gone out another door, but he's just checking. And as soon as he makes sure there's no other footprints, he does a scan of his entire house. Because now he's convinced that someone's in his house. He goes to the attic. He goes all around. He's yelling. I mean, he's looking everywhere. There's nothing. There's no one in the house. The family's concerned, but there's no one in the house. So he keeps everything locked, and he goes outside and he starts tracking these footprints back to where they came from. He walks all the way to the forest, and they just kind of stop abruptly. Like they just started kind of magically at the edge of the tree line and walked right up to his house, but there's no clear origination besides it's just in the forest somewhere. And there's also no clear sense of what happened once they arrived at the door. So after doing one more loop around his property, he goes in the barn, he goes in the shed, he goes back in his house, he's checking the attic, he's looking everywhere, and he can't find any indication that some stranger is here. He finally decides that he's going to tell someone about what's been happening at his property. And so they did have a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who was his closest neighbor, who was not really that close, but a couple hundred yards away. And he goes over and he tells Lorenz everything. I've been hearing sounds. My maid quit because she was hearing sounds. We looked in the attic. We couldn't find anything. Then we started hearing sounds. The keys go missing. There's this newspaper in my house. My granddaughter's running out in the middle of the night. She's disappearing. She doesn't know what's going on. These footprints. I can't make sense of it. And so Lorenz, also not knowing what to make of it, suggests like, hey, I have extra weapons. You want to take an extra rifle and arm yourself, protect yourself? And Andreas just says, you know what? No, I'm good. I'm going to pass on the rifle. I'm probably overreacting anyways, and I'm sure we're just fine. But it would turn out he was not just fine, and he probably should have taken up Lorenz on the offer. So just a couple of days after speaking with his neighbor about the weirdness happening on his property, the Gruber family got a little bit of good news, which was they finally were able to locate another maid, a live-in maid, to come stay with them to replace the one who had left because she believed the place was haunted. And so a few weeks later, on March 31st, 1922, this new maid shows up to Hinterkaifeck. But unfortunately, this would also be the same date a horrible tragedy unfolds at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Over the course of 24 hours, someone or something was in the barn on Hinterkaifeck and was able to silently lure in members of the Gruber family one by one. Without telling anybody else what they were doing, they would walk over almost like in a trance into the barn where they would be struck in the head by something called a mattock, which is kind of like an axe. Blow to the head and they're down. As soon as they're down, whoever was in there, whatever was in there, would take their bodies and move them to the corner and lay them down, kind of square them up against the corner of the barn, and then cover them with hay. And then as soon as they were deceased, he would go, whatever it was, would go back and lure in the next person. So over a whole day, each of these members of the family were being lured into this barn where investigators, nobody knows what it was that was luring them in. They weren't scared when they went in. Their guard was down, and they would go in and then get hit in the head with this mattock until there was 4 people stacked up in the corner. And at that point, the remaining 2 people on the farm were still in the house sleeping, and whoever was doing this went into the house and used the mattock to end their lives as well. 4 days later, on April 4th, a repairman who was scheduled to come to the Hinterkaifeck farm shows up to repair the feeding machine. He goes to the door, he knocks on the door, and it's locked, and he can see lights on inside, he can hear the dog barking inside, but no one comes to greet him. Now, the feeder was outside of the main house, and it was actually on basically a public area of the farm, so he didn't need them to physically get to the feeder, and he knew how to fix it. So after trying the front door, going to the back door, looking in the windows and seeing lights, hearing the dog, but everything's locked, he just said, you know what, I'm just gonna do the job. So he goes into the area where the feeder is, he does the repair, and as he's leaving, he notices that the dog that was barking, that was inside the house, is now outside the house tied up. And so he goes over to that section of the house thinking, oh, well, now I'll knock on the door. Someone's sure to see me. And again, no one comes to the door. And the back door, that clearly must have just been opened to let the dog out, is locked again. And so he's like, man, that's odd. And so instead of just leaving, he finishes the job with the feeder, and he goes over to Lorenz Schlittenbauer's house, the neighbor, and he says, hey, just so you know, I was just over at the Gruber family's farm. I fixed their feeder like they wanted me to, but no one was there, but maybe somebody was there because the dog was inside, then it was outside. Don't know what's going on, but can you just let them know that I was here because I couldn't get in touch with them. But it prompts Schlittenbauer to go check on the Grubers because they haven't seen him in a couple days anyways, and so they figure they'll swing by and just make sure everything's okay. So they go over to Hinterkaifeck, and the lights are on in the house, the dog sure enough is outside, the doors are locked, and they see that the barn is actually open. So they go over to the barn, and in the barn, at first they don't see anything, but in the back corner underneath some hay are 4 of the bodies of the Gruber family. They go inside and they find the remaining 2 bodies, and no one else is there. Although there was signs of someone recently eating in the kitchen. The fire was lit, it was like the house was being lived in at that very moment. Although to Schlittenbauer and anybody that was there, they have no way of knowing that it's been days since the Gruber family had passed away. And so they end up leaving and getting in touch with authorities. So the police show up and they're able to determine with relative certainty that the tragedy took place on March 31st. But for 4 days afterwards, someone lived in the Gruber house, slept in their beds, ate their food, lit fires, lounged around inside, they played with the dog, they milked the cows. I mean, they lived in this house. They ran the farm for 4 days. And other neighbors would even say that, we saw smoke coming out of the chimney on, April 3rd and April 2nd. And so it was confirmed that someone had been staying in this house, which is so creepy. And so the police are a little bit baffled, and they're like, okay, well then it was probably a drifter. Target of opportunity, they probably saw this isolated farm, and they probably were going to rob them, stay there a little bit, and then leave. But when they searched the farmhouse, there were large sums of cash that were just out practically in the open, barely hidden, that had not been taken. And anybody that was robbing the place would have taken the cash. And so probably wasn't a robbery, which leaves maybe a crime of passion, but they were like, what's the motive? And unfortunately, Andreas was not particularly well liked in the town that was nearby. And so there was lots of people that didn't like Andreas, which made it really hard to whittle it down. So they started just interviewing like crazy. They're talking to hundreds of people that were in connection with, that could be connected to this, but they're getting nowhere. They did feel like Lorenz Schlittenbauer was probably the best suspect, because he's right there, he's right next door, he's their neighbor, and in fact he had wanted to marry Victoria, the daughter, and Andreas had told him outright no, and they thought that could be a reason. But the big issue with Lorenz Schlittenbauer being the primary suspect is he had a farm to keep and a family to take care of, and so how could he have committed this crime and then ran the Hinterkaifeck farm for 4 days and lived there and slept there without his family knowing? And his family's like, no, he's been here with us. And so the police, they aren't able to solve it. They don't really have any decent suspects, and so they kind of leave it with, well, whoever did this probably had been there for about 6 months, potentially, before they committed the crime, and then stayed there for a few days afterwards, and then vanished. To this day, they have not been caught. And they even reopened this case in 2007. But they found that, despite the number of suspects and despite the evidence available, it just wasn't enough to provide any sort of clarity on what actually happened. So it remains a huge mystery. So like any other high-profile unsolved mystery, there are literally hundreds of potential explanations for what could have happened, but what I'm most interested in is what you all think could have happened. I will do my best to look through your comments, and I'll respond to the ones that are the most interesting or the most plausible, so please, if you would, in the comment section, let me know what you think happened at Hinterkaifeck. And if you haven't already, please gently 360 no-scope the like button, and then please also subscribe and turn on all notifications so you get more content just like this in the days to follow. That's gonna do it, guys. I hope this was interesting. If you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out to me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416, and I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen there as well. And that's gonna do it, guys, and I will talk to you soon. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you a picture that is famously associated with them. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, then please throat punch the like button and then subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Between 1974 and 1975, a criminal who had been dubbed the Visayala Ransacker had been terrorizing the Eastern District of Sacramento, California. Initially, he would break into people's homes when they were sleeping by prying open one of their windows. He would go inside and basically ransack their house. He wouldn't steal any of the major valuables that were right in plain sight. He would just kind of throw things all over the place and would take 1 or 2 small things, probably as a souvenir. Unfortunately, by the summer of 1976, this Visayala Ransacker was not only not caught, but was also no longer satisfied with just breaking into people's homes and ransacking them and taking a few things. He had moved on to killing people, and so he had been given a new nickname, one that just about everybody knew at the time, and that was the Golden State Killer. Once he began killing people, he became much more cautious about how he would actually go about attacking them. He would oftentimes break into his victims' homes while they weren't there, and he would walk their property, look for guns and unload them. He would look for any security cameras or devices and turn them off. He would plant ligatures, pieces of rope and twine that he could use to bind people's arms and legs. He would place them in their house, and then he would leave. And he would study his victims and get to know their patterns and know when they were going to be in the house, when they were going to be in certain rooms. And then at some point, he would sneak in through a window at night while they were sleeping, and the victims would wake up with him standing over them with a flashlight in their face. On the rare occasion where neighbors or police had actually spotted this guy, they saw that he was wearing a full face mask and he was very athletic. He was able to elude police capture and would jump over fences and would run away. By the end of 1976, when the Golden State Killer had still not been caught, citizens of Sacramento became furious with the police. They felt like they were not doing enough to try to catch this guy. So on November 3rd, 1976, the police actually host this huge town hall meeting, and they invite all the citizens of Sacramento to come be a part of it, voice your complaints, listen to what police are actually trying to do to catch the Golden State Killer, and basically just have an opportunity to air your grievances a little bit. During the meeting, a man in the crowd who was a citizen of Sacramento stands up and basically starts making fun of the Golden State Killer, calling him weak and a coward, saying, you're preying on women. If you ever came to my house, I would totally beat the crap out of you. Like, this guy's a joke. And everybody in the town hall meeting just totally ate it up. It was like this one little victory for the town of Sacramento is we're going to put down the Golden State Killer for being weak and a coward. Then, in an ironic twist of fate, that guy who was making fun of the Golden State Killer, he and his wife became the next victims of the Golden State Killer. And in fact, the Golden State Killer changed his entire MO. Instead of kind of targeting random people all over Sacramento, he began only targeting married couples, and he would always attack when the husband was home. For decades, the Golden State Killer eluded capture and even taunted the police in threatening phone calls all the way up until 2001. But in 2016, they reinvestigated the Golden State Killer case using DNA evidence, something that was not available in the 70s and the 80s when they were investigating these crimes. And it was through this reinvestigation that they were able to capture 74-year-old Joseph D'Angelo in 2018, who was, in fact, the Golden State Killer. D'Angelo pled guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and was given 12 consecutive life sentences. When the killer was finally identified as Joseph D'Angelo, police were going through some of the older case photos and they made a startling discovery. This is a picture from the November 3rd, 1976 town hall meeting, and there in the middle of the photo is none other than Joseph D'Angelo, aka the Golden State Killer. And he was there when that citizen of Sacramento stood up and began berating the Golden State Killer, saying how he was a coward and weak and that he would totally beat him up if he ever came to his house. And there's Joseph D'Angelo sitting there listening to this guy. And after the meeting, what does he do? He targets the guy that spoke out against him. And even after he attacked this guy, apparently he was so upset that he changed his entire MO and only targeted married couples from that point on, as if he was proving a point that you can't touch me. By the time Tyler Hadley turned 15, he was skipping school regularly and hanging out with the wrong crowd. Tyler's parents had tried to do everything to get their son back on track between doctor's visits, psychiatry appointments, medication, an outpatient mental health program, but none of it seemed to work. Tyler just was on the wrong path. As Tyler's behavior continued to get worse as he got older, his parents just didn't know what to do, became very frustrated with him, and became very, very strict disciplinarians. One night when Tyler came home and he appeared to be intoxicated, his parents took his phone and car away, and Tyler was furious. And he confided in his best friend Michael Mandel that he thought his parents had gone over the line, that they were over-disciplining him, and he said to Michael that he wanted to kill his mother. Now, Michael knew Tyler and had known him since he was a little kid, and he did not think twice about this claim that, Tyler wanted to kill his mom. He just thought that Tyler was frustrated with his parents, and Michael did know that Tyler's parents were very, very strict and hard on him. So he just kind of wrote it off. Not long after this incident, Tyler starts talking about this huge house party he's going to have. And all of Tyler's friends, including Michael, just didn't buy it. They're like, there's no way you could ever pull this off. Your parents are too strict and they never leave town anyways. But every time people approached him, he would say, oh no, my parents aren't going to be there. They'll never find out. At some point, Michael gets a Facebook invitation to Tyler's big house party, and he sees that it's been sent to so many people. It's been sent well beyond an inner circle of friends to just total strangers. And then on the Facebook invitation itself, someone had posted on the wall, hey Tyler, what are you going to do if your parents come home? And he responded to that, they won't, trust me. On the day of the party, Michael shows up to Tyler's house and it is packed with people. Lots of people he didn't know, and he was fairly certain Tyler didn't know them either. And he goes inside and it's clear that no one gives a crap about the house itself. People are writing on the walls, people have spilled stuff all over the ground, there's broken glass on the ground, people are rummaging through the food in the fridge. No one cared about the house. And Tyler, oddly enough, didn't seem to mind at all. The only time Tyler became on edge was when he felt like the party was getting too loud. And he would go around and tell people to be quiet because he didn't want his neighbors to hear, because the neighbors would call the police and he didn't want the police coming to the house. During this big party, Tyler pulls Michael aside and says, hey, I gotta tell you something, come outside with me. When they get outside, Tyler looks at Mike and just says, Mike, I killed my parents. Michael doesn't believe him, but Tyler says, no, look in my driveway, their car is still here, they did not go to Orlando, I killed my parents. Michael still didn't believe him, and Tyler said, go inside. I bet if you look around, you'll find blood in my house. So he goes inside and he starts looking around, and when he goes upstairs, he sees there's blood on a table right outside the master bedroom where Tyler's parents slept. And on the door handle to the master bedroom, there was also blood. So he goes back down and he goes, Tyler, you're playing a prank on me. And Tyler goes, no, when the party dies down, I'll show you proof. At this point, Michael is starting to think this could actually be real. And Tyler walks away, and Michael's thinking to himself, I can't wait till the end of this party to see if this is really true or not. So he goes upstairs, goes to the bloody door handle to the master bedroom, opens it up, and the door actually hits the leg of Tyler's father, who's laying on the ground, who's deceased inside of the master bedroom. He shuts the door and he's standing in the hall and he doesn't know what to do, because on the one hand, Tyler's his friend, but he just discovered Tyler's a murderer. He also knew Tyler's parents really well, so he's deeply saddened by what he just saw. And as he's standing there, he's realizing that he has to turn Tyler in. And so for some reason, he just felt the need to take one more picture with Tyler, because he knew as soon as he left the house, he was going to go tell authorities what Tyler had done, and he was never going to see him again. And so he goes over to Tyler and he takes this picture. After Tyler was arrested, he admitted that just hours before this house party, he had bludgeoned his parents to death and stashed them in the master bedroom. Tyler was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and while he has been remorseful, he's never given a real reason why he actually killed his parents. On the morning of Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, a Colorado high school student named Brooks Brown noted something strange. His on-again, off-again friend named Eric had missed all of the classes that morning, something that is totally uncharacteristic of Eric, who was a straight-A student. At lunchtime, Brown left the high school to go to the designated smoking area in the parking lot, and he saw parked in a very far-away spot, somewhere that he never saw him park before, was his friend Eric, who was in the back of his car pulling a large duffel bag out of the trunk. Brown puts his cigarette out and walks over and asks Eric, where have you been all morning? And Eric turns to Brown and goes, it doesn't matter. I'd like you, so you should leave right now. Go home. Brown was taken back by his tone and the general weirdness of the morning, but Eric was always kind of a wild card. He was a guy that had, in the past, vandalized Brown's house, he had posted death threats online about Brown. And then simultaneously, he would brag to Brown all the time about different accomplishments, like he desperately wanted approval from Brown. So it was a very strange relationship they had. Brown doesn't really know what to make of this, and so he kind of just shrugs his shoulders, turns around and walks away, while Eric turns around and continues doing whatever he's doing with his duffel bag. Brown gets back over to the smoking area, and he's thinking, maybe I should just skip class and go home, because maybe Eric has some prank that he's got planned that he's protecting me from. And as he's sitting there smoking a cigarette, thinking about whether or not he's going to stay or go, he hears noises coming from the high school that he immediately assumes are fireworks. And so in his mind, he's like, oh, looks like he was planning a senior prank. He's lighting fireworks inside of the school. But then the sounds got faster and louder, and he turned to look at the school and he heard people screaming, and he knew those weren't fireworks, those were gunshots. Brown immediately runs to the nearest house, knocks on their door, and is able to get a phone, and he calls police. After Eric had spoken to Brown, when Brown came across the lot and asked him what he was doing, and then ultimately Brown turned around and walked back to the smoke pit, Eric had turned his attention to his duffel bag. He had pulled it out and dragged it across the lot to another car where one of his other friends named Dylan was also getting his own duffel bag out of the back of his own car. Inside of their duffel bags were propane tank time bombs that they planned to place all around the school in an effort to collapse the ceiling of the cafeteria, because what they wanted to do is get people to start running out of the school so they could start shooting at them. Eric and Dylan's car were parked far away from their usual spots, kind of strategically located near where first responders were bound to come in, and they had rigged their cars to explode so that when they did come through, they would detonate and hopefully take out the first responders as well. Eric and Dylan had also placed another timed explosive on a field about 3 miles away that was purely a diversion. They were hoping it would go off, it would get police and first responders over there first, giving them more time to inflict max damage on the school. But with the exception of the diversionary bomb that did go off, none of the other explosives in the high school actually went off. So Dylan and Eric had to go to plan B, which is to walk right in the school and just start shooting. At the end of the day, 12 students from Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado had been killed, along with one of their teachers, as well as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the two shooters. At the time, this was far and away the deadliest American school shooting. This senior class picture was taken 2 weeks before the Columbine shooting, and you can clearly see Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold pointing finger guns at the camera. At the time this picture was taken, they both knew what they were going to do to the students in that picture, because they had been planning this attack for over a year and referred to it as Judgment Day. So that's going to do it, guys. Give me your reactions to these 3 stories in the comments section, and I will pin the best comment at the top. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please throat punch the like button and subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. You can direct message me on Instagram and Twitter. My username is JohnBallen416 on both platforms. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok. My username is MrBallen over there. We have a subreddit just called MrBallen. That's where you should put your story suggestions. If I intentionally use one, I will credit you. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I'm going to share with you the picture that is famously associated with them. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tar and feather the like button, and then subscribe to this channel, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In September 2006, 26-year-old Jodi Arias met 29-year-old Travis Alexander at a big business convention in Las Vegas. The two hit it off immediately, with Travis on the same day he met her inviting Jodi to be his guest at his company's formal dinner that night. After the dinner was over, Travis and Jodi stayed up all night chatting with each other, and the next day, Travis was telling his friends at this convention that he had, quote, found his wife. After the convention was over, Travis and Jodi would continue to see each other, even though it was a long-distance relationship. Travis lived in Arizona and Jodi lived in California. But they would meet up and they would travel and take beautiful pictures and post to social media. It just seemed like they were a dream couple that were so happy together. While the couple's social media posts might have made it seem like they were this perfect couple, Travis's friends began to notice some very strange behavior by Jody early on in their relationship. Jody just seemed totally obsessed with Travis. She could not keep her hands off of him. Travis would be talking to his friends, and Jody would come up beside him and literally grab onto him and cling to him. And Travis would try to push her off of him, and she would just come right back and grab onto him. But it wasn't playful and jokey and funny. It was like she literally needed to be holding on to Travis. Jody would get really upset anytime Travis was interacting with a female. Didn't matter their age or their relationship to Travis. It was like she just could not hack any other females in his life. She would follow Travis anytime he went to the bathroom, and she would put her ear to the door and try to eavesdrop in case there was somebody else in the bathroom that Travis could have been talking to. She began showing up to Travis's house totally unannounced at all hours. And one time when the house was locked and Travis wasn't even home, she snuck into the house through the doggy door. Initially, Travis's friends just thought it was weird behavior, but over time, they started to feel like Jody might actually be dangerous. And so they sat him down one day and they kind of had like an intervention. And they said, "Hey, Travis, there is something off about Jody. Her behavior is just totally weird, and it seems like she is just never gonna let you go. I think you need to break this off and just find a way to cut ties with this woman." As they're speaking to him, they hear something outside of the room they're in, which had all the doors closed. And Travis stands up, walks over, opens the door, and standing right there is Jody. She was eavesdropping, and she was furious. And she looked in at all of them and gave them absolute death stares and stormed off. Shortly after this intervention, Travis takes his friend's advice and he does break it off with Jody, and he kind of moves on with his life. Now remember, he lives in Arizona and Jody lives in California, so you'd think it would be pretty easy to break up because you're never going to run into each other. And that's what Travis was kind of banking on, that he could get a fresh start and never see her again. But about 2 weeks after they broke up, Jody moved to Arizona. Around the same time, Travis starts dating a new woman named Lisa. And almost immediately, Jody starts stalking Lisa, showing up at her house, tapping on her windows and running away. She started slashing Travis's tires. I mean, she was a total menace. She was trying to break them up. But a few months after she arrived in Arizona, Jody ultimately packs up and heads back to California in April of 2008. And Travis, Lisa, his girlfriend, and all of Travis's friends are so relieved. They felt like now the breakup is final. 2 months after Jody leaves Arizona and goes back to California, Travis misses a really big business meeting. And at first, his friends are calling him and kind of giving him a hard time about missing this meeting, but he wasn't responding. And after a couple of days, his friends decided they needed to go do a welfare check and make sure he really was okay. They go to his house, they open it up, and immediately when they walk in, they see blood on the carpet, and they're calling out for Travis. Travis is nowhere to be found. They walk through the house and they discover in the bathroom Travis's body. He was dead and laying in the tub. They call the police, who come over and immediately suspect Jody Arias, who denies that she was ever there, that she had left, she was in Arizona, that she had nothing to do with this. But during the investigation, they find a camera inside of the washing machine inside of Travis's house. They were able to dry it off and extract the last few pictures that were taken on the camera. The first few pictures are of Jody herself. She's clearly inside of Travis's house. And then at some point she goes into the bathroom where Travis was. He's taking a shower. She takes this picture, and then immediately following this picture, she proceeds to stab Travis to death. In May of 2013, Jody Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in jail without parole. By September of 1985, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano in Colombia was starting to show signs of significant activity. The tremors had become so powerful that the citizens of a nearby town called Amero, that was home to 31,000 people, they started to become very concerned. If this thing were to go off, we're only 30 miles away, we'd be leveled. And unfortunately, just a couple of months later, on November 13th, 1985, the volcano would erupt, and it would create a massive mudslide that would just devastate Amero. The mud flow covered 85% of this town in heavy, thick sludge. It destroyed buildings and bridges, and it killed 25,000 people. Remember, there's only 31,000 people in this village to begin with, so 80% of the population has been killed by this mudslide. Because of how big of a disaster this was, it took a while for the rescue efforts to mobilize, and so anybody that was on the fringe of being saved unfortunately perished because no one was there to rescue them in time. And then when rescue crews did get out and did start helping people, there just wasn't enough. There weren't enough people to help. And so hundreds of people that could have been saved were just trapped and no one could get to them in time. Photojournalist Frank Fournier arrived in Colombia 2 days after this eruption with the intent to photograph the ground rescue that was going on inside of Amaro. When he actually arrived in Amaro, he was really shocked to see just how completely destroyed this town was and how totally ineffective the rescue efforts were. It was just totally chaotic. It wasn't really clear who was helping who. There were people literally dying all over the place. It just seemed crazy that this was not being handled better. Amid this chaos, a farmer approached Frank and told him he needed to come over and try to help this girl who was trapped under a house. So he brings Frank over to this house that's been completely submerged in water and mud, and clinging to a branch is this 13-year-old girl named Omaira Sanchez that's been trapped up to her neck in water. She's pinned by something in the water. They didn't know what it was, but she's been there for 60 hours. When Frank arrived, he spoke to the other rescuers that were there trying to get her out, and they said that she's been in great spirits and she's been joking about how she doesn't want to be late for school. She's just been a really positive force and we really want to get her out, but it keeps raining, so the water keeps rising and she's already up to her neck and she's just trapped. We can't get her out. Shortly after Frank arrives, Omaira went from chipper and lively and kind of making light of everything to most likely realizing that she wasn't going to get out of the water. And so she began telling the rescue workers to let her be, to let her rest. And she propped herself over this branch and she just laid there, kind of allowing herself to pass away. Frank felt totally helpless. I mean, he's looking at this poor girl that's going to die unless they can get her out of the water, but no one seems to be able to do it. It just seemed totally impossible that we can't just find a way to get her out. But it would turn out that her foot was pinned under a brick door, and her aunt, who had passed away and was trapped under the rubble, had grabbed her ankle and had died that way. So it was like a death grip on her ankle. And so not knowing what to do, Frank just did what he knew how to do, which was take pictures. And he knelt down and he took this picture of Omaira. And very shortly after this picture was taken, she would pass away. This picture would win the 1986 World Press Photo of the Year. When it was published, it was so disturbing that this poor girl was not able to be rescued that it created an international backlash on Colombia's nearly non-existent rescue efforts. Ed Gein was always a little bit off. His classmates and his teachers recalled him being very shy, but at the same time having these strange mannerisms where all of a sudden he would burst out hysterically laughing, usually at something he had been muttering to himself in class. The school blamed Ed's mother for Ed's kind of odd behavior because Ed would admit that his mother punished him if he showed signs of having friends. So Ed's childhood was incredibly lonely and isolated. Ed's mother would confine he, along with his brother Henry, to their farm. He was basically never allowed to leave with the exception of school, and when he was at the farm, his mother would regularly read from the Bible and would tell Ed and his brother Henry that basically everybody else in the world is evil. We are the only pure ones, everyone is evil, and you should stay away from them. In 1944, when Ed was 38 years old, he and his brother Henry were burning away some marsh vegetation on their property. And at some point, the fire got out of control, and the fire department had to be called in. And after they put out the fire, Ed was okay, but they couldn't find Henry. He was just gone. That night, Henry's body was found face down in the marsh in that same area where the burn was going on. He had died of asphyxiation. At first, the fire was blamed, but then authorities discovered that Henry had actually died before the fire started. And so all eyes turned to Ed, who was the only one with him at the time, but there was no hard evidence connecting Ed to Henry, and Ed said, "I didn't do it." So Henry's death remained labeled an accident, even though basically everyone believed that Ed must have been the guy that strangled his brother to death before the fire was set. Shortly after his brother's death, Ed's mother also died, leaving Ed alone in this farmhouse. Ed began to make some modifications to the farmhouse, not to improve it or to make it bigger and better, but rather to board off all of the rooms in the house that his mother ever used, He basically made them time capsules. He didn't touch them, he just sealed them off. And so he confined himself to a single room in this farmhouse that he did not take care of. And so filth is just piling up everywhere. And so he just kind of lived in squalor in this one weird room. While living in seclusion, Ed became obsessed with cannibalism. He basically spent all his time reading about cannibalism inside of this tiny room in his boarded up farmhouse. And that's how he lived his life for the next 10 years. No one really ever saw him. Then, in November of 1957, a local hardware store owner, her name was Bernice Worden, goes missing. When police show up at the store to have a look around, they find bloodstains all over the place, and they discover in the register that the last person to make a purchase inside of the store was Ed Gein. So they go to Ed Gein's house to interview him and see if he knows anything about Bernice Worden, and so they're bracing themselves for probably finding her body at Ed's house. But they were not prepared for what they actually found at his house. What they find would end up inspiring movies like Silence of the Lambs, Psycho, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Basically, inside of Ed's house was a whole bunch of human remains, but not in the way that you would imagine. Ed was taking human body parts and making things like kitchen utensils and bowls, and he was using skin to create seats and lampshades and bedposts. I mean, his whole house was like built of human bones and flesh. Bernice Worden's body was found as well, and she was kind of hung up as if she was next up to be made into some sort of kitchen utensil or chair or table. When questioned, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Worden, but as for the dozens of other bodies that were inside of the house, he claims they were from robbing graves, but no one really knew if that was true or not, and they weren't able to ever actually convict him for anything beyond the killing of Bernice Worden. As for his motive, he told investigators that what he really wanted to do, what he intended to do, was build what he called a woman suit that would resemble his mother, and it would allow him to, quote, crawl into his mother's skin. He was deemed unfit to stand trial, and he was sent to a mental hospital where he stayed until his death in 1984. Here is just a sampling of some of the things that Ed Gein made using human body parts. What is not pictured here are things like his lampshade, his seat, as well as his gloves and his belt. If you feel so inclined, you can Google those things. All right, that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments section what you thought of today's stories. I'll get back to all the early commenters, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's stories and you haven't done this already, please tar and feather the like button, and then subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. Feel free to DM me on Instagram and on Twitter. My username's the same on both platforms, JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok. My username there is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. If I use your story on purpose, I will credit you. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, some combination, just know that I'm really appreciative of your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya.